In this lecture, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the relationships between human cultures and wild food plants. Now, when most of us think about the relationships between human cultures and food plants, we tend to think about agricultural food plants, those food plants that tend to make up the bulk of our diet or the staples in our diet. So we think about things like rice or corn or taro, etc. But wild food plants played really important roles in human cultures in the past, and they continue to do so today, even in agricultural societies. All human societies depended on wild food plants for thousands of years. We think that the origins of agriculture were about 10,000 or perhaps more years ago, but before that, all societies were dependent on gathering wild plant and animal products for their survival. Today, wild food plants continue to be used in some capacity by most cultures, and that includes all agricultural societies as well. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'll give you examples of foods that are gathered from wild environments, spices and condiments that are gathered from wild environments, and the role of agricultural weeds as wild plants in agricultural societies. I'll talk about this by emphasizing the use of wild food plants in Hawaii in the past and in today. So a number of wild fruits were gathered by Hawaiians here in the past. We know that the Hawaiians brought their canoe plants with them, which included a number of agricultural crops, which are the main staples of the Hawaiian diet. These are things, of course, like taro and sweet potato. There are bananas and sugarcane and other things that you have heard or will be hearing about in the class. But to supplement the diet and to complement the diet during periods of fruiting or when people were in the forest were a whole bunch of wild food plants that Hawaiians could use. These include a lot of fruits. So things like akala, the Hawaiian raspberry, many of you may be familiar with, or hello berries. Those of you who have been to the Big Island will certainly be familiar with those. Lolu fruits. Lolu are the native Hawaiian palms. They're very rare today, so you don't see too many of them, but their fruit is edible and was eaten as a complement in the past. Lama fruit. Lama is a native tree that you'll find here on Hawaii as well, up in the higher areas of the mountains, both in the Ko'olaus and the Waianaes. You can recognize it from its really dark bark and bright yellow or orange or sometimes even red fruits. And these fruits are edible and were eaten in the past by Hawaiians. And challah fruits as well. Hawaiians didn't only make use of wild fruits, but other parts of plants as well, and these include leaves. So some examples are popolo, or solanum species, or pakai, or amaranth species. And this is actually interesting because solanum species and amaranth species, wild species of these two genera, are used as wild food plants in many different countries across the world. Hawaiians also made use of wild tubers and roots for food. These include things like the morning glory or pohuihui, which some of you may be familiar with if you've gone out along Makapu'u and some other coastal areas. Kaena Point, much of it is covered with pohuihui. In addition to fruits and leaves and roots or tubers, the stems of some plants were also used as important sources of wild food. And in Hawaii, this was particularly true of tree ferns. The hapu'u tree fern, or ama'u, especially. These tree fern trunks are filled with a whole bunch of starch that pigs like, and of course are edible to humans as well. For example, the trunk of one hapu'u fern can contain from 50 to 70 pounds of pure starch, which is pretty amazing. So the hapu'u trunks or stems were cut down and then steamed underground and eaten. And these were important source of food that became particularly important during famine time. Sometimes you'll hear the use of the word famine food. When you hear it, it doesn't just mean that that food was only eaten in times of famine. Famine foods can refer to foods that were normally eaten but became more important or become more important during times of stress. They could be those that are less preferred and are occasionally eaten, or they could be starvation foods. It's like when everything else fails, you can eat these things. But when we say famine foods, it doesn't just mean that it's eaten only in times of famine. It could serve as a complement during other times as well. Ferns were also gathered for other purposes, not just the trunks. Ho'io fern and other ferns were the fronds were gathered, and they could be and the shoots, young shoots as well. They could be steamed or eaten raw, etc. When the first Hawaiians came to Hawaii, they brought their agricultural food plants with them and, of course, planted them in around the houses. But apparently they also planted individuals out in the forests. These individuals then continued to multiply and they became naturalized. So there were wild populations of some of the canoe plants in the forest as well, including taro and ape, bananas, mountain apple, etc. So in the past, these kinds of foods were also thought of as wild foods or can be thought of as wild foods and were gathered from the forest as well. Today, when we think about wild foods in Hawaii, most of the things that we think about are also naturalized plants. Those are plants that are not native to here. They were brought in by people, planted here, and then began to reproduce and grow in the forest, and now they grow like any other component of the forest, and we call them naturalized. So when we think about wild food gathering in Hawaii, we think about things like guava, like strawberry, guava, blackberry, mango, avocado, lilikoi, etc. These are all wild food plants that many of you, or most of you, should be familiar with. We eat them at different times, but they're naturalized. They weren't here before people came. But they continue to play a role in people's lives in Hawaii today. There's other naturalized wild food plants here in Hawaii besides those that we gather for fruit, and those include some of the ferns. So this picture here is a picture of a Ho'io fern. It's not the native, it's an introduced species that's now naturalized and grows wild in the forest. This is a picture taken in Waiahole. And the fronds are gathered and eaten, and sometimes you'll see them in the markets as well. So it's another example. So apart from products that we tend to think of as foods that are gathered from the wild, spices and condiments are also gathered from wild environments. Today, you can think of some examples here in Hawaii. These include, for instance, ko'oko'olau or mamaki. Both of them are native plants here in Hawaii that continue to be gathered in fair quantities in the wild and are used in teas, and you'll find them in stores here today as well. Agricultural weeds are another class of wild food plants that can be really important in agricultural societies. So these are the wild plants that come up in your agricultural fields that, of course, you didn't plant. Any of you who've had a garden, I'm sure, can come up with a whole list of different things. I have a garden here in the Manoa Community Gardens, and the kinds of things that come up in my plot that I didn't plant are types of amaranth, solanum species, oxalis, which is the wood sorrel. All of these are edible, and all of these can provide good sources of vitamins and minerals, good sources of nutrition. And in agricultural societies, these can be really important resources, especially in societies where the bulk of the calories of the diet come from one plant. So in Asia, for example, much of people's caloric intake comes from rice. However, there's a lot of different wild plants that come up in rice paddies that people eat, and these can provide really important sources of nutrition, especially for women and children. So wild foods can be really important in agricultural societies in terms of foods gathered from wild environments, spices and condiments, and agricultural weeds. One of the things that should be clear from some of the examples I've been giving you is that humans use and have used a really wide variety of plants and plant parts as wild foods. So I've talked about fruits and tubers and roots and stems and leaves. Wild flowers are often eaten as well, or seeds. And in fact, another interesting part of the plant that many of you may have eaten is the apical meristem. This is the part of the stem, the growing part of the stem. And if any of you have eaten palm heart, sometimes that's grown here. You can get it here. It's grown on the Big Island, but often if you buy it in a can from the supermarket, that's palm heart that's harvested from wild palms, often in tropical rainforests, especially from the Amazon. And that's the apical meristem that you're eating. Now, because wild plants do continue to play an important role in agricultural societies, when people have done studies looking at the knowledge of wild plants in agricultural societies, that they found that it's very high and that it can be comparable to knowledge of wild plants in hunter-gatherer societies. Okay, so just because a society is agricultural and depends primarily on agricultural crops doesn't mean that knowledge of wild plants isn't there or isn't important. So I talked a little bit about how wild food plants can play an important role in nutrition and in health. As I've mentioned, they could be important complementary foods, things that you can gather during seasons and add to your diet, and they could be famine foods as well. When all else fails, or when agriculture crops are under stress, you can depend more and more on these foods. They can provide important sources of nutrients and non-nutrients. So these are the examples I gave you of some of the agricultural weeds that can be really important sources of nutrients in agricultural societies that depend on a very small number of crops for their diet. Wild food plants can also function very importantly as medicinal plants. One of the themes that runs across this course is that you can't make a distinction between a food plant and a medicinal plant because it's often the same thing. And there is no real distinction between food or medicine. And there's a couple of really good examples of this that are also in your Balick and Cox textbook. And both of these examples come from Africa. One comes from the Maasai people living in Kenya. The Maasai are a pastoral people. They're cattle herders who live off the milk and meat and blood of cattle. They have, for the same reason, they have really high rates of cholesterol intake. So they eat something like 2,000 milligrams of cholesterol daily, whereas here the maximum recommended daily income is something like 300 milligrams. So an enormous amount of cholesterol is eaten, but they have very, very low levels of blood cholesterol. So this was a mystery for some time. People came up with different kinds of explanations and were looking at genetic factors, etc. But it was an ethnobotanist, Tim Johns, who found what the answer was, and that was that it had to do with the gathering of wild food plants. What happens is that the Maasai make their soups, which are meat boiled in milk, and they gather the bark of wild trees to put in those soup. And the ethnobotanist, Tim Johns, was able to do chemical assays and show that it was the use of those barks in the soups that had cholesterol-lowering properties and helped them reduce really high levels of blood cholesterol. So again, this is a wild food plant that's functioning as these are wild food plants that function as medicinal plants as well. A second example also comes from Africa, and it comes from the work done from one of the ethnobotanists, Dr. Nina Etkin, here at the University of Hawaii in the anthropology department. Working with the Hausa people, she found that most of the diet, these are agricultural people, and most of the diet was based on sorghum and millet and peanuts, etc. But they added a lot of wild foods. I think it was something like she collected something like 61 species of wild plants, wild or semi-wild, to their meals. And what she found was that many of these wild plants were adaptive against malaria. So again, these are things that are eaten as food, but they're also medicinal, as they may be helping to prevent malaria. Some people, and I've heard this in numerous places, also feel that eating wild foods has spiritual value. So they feel that it's important to eat something wild every day or often as a way of connecting to the environment. So again, lots of different ways in which wild food plants can play an important role in nutrition and health. Of course, not all wild food plants are very good for human health and nutrition. In fact, many wild food plants are quite problematic for us. Many wild food plants are poisonous. Examples that come immediately to mind are, of course, mushrooms. Many wild food plants are indigestible to us. A lot of leaves are very fibrous, stems are fibrous. They're things that we can't digest. Wild food plants can be very difficult to gather. Any of you have gone out into the mountains and tried to gather avocado or mango or lilikoi or mountain apple really high up in the tree know that it can be really difficult to get to. So there might be a whole lot of fruit that looks really good but is not easy to gather. A lot of wild food plants are low in nutritional value. Not all of them are high, as the examples I was giving you. And of course, wild food plants are very seasonal, or can be very seasonal. You can only harvest fruit in a certain time of year, flowers, roots, etc. The gathering of wild food plants therefore requires that the cultures who depend on them develop a really strong knowledge of the local environment. They develop a really important knowledge of the ecology of the environment around them. We're going to come back to this concept later in class, but this knowledge that's developed by cultures of their local ecology is often termed traditional ecological knowledge or traditional environmental knowledge. So for instance, in order to be able to gather wild plants, humans need to develop a good knowledge of where things grow, where things produce best, at what times of year in which they produce, what other things eat them, what things affect them, etc. So all these ecological interactions people develop a knowledge of. People also need to develop a knowledge, of course, of what kinds of things are edible. And there's lots of cues that people may take in order to do that. But one of the most important ones is watching other animals and seeing what they eat and what they don't eat. In particular, watching primates, seeing what they eat and what they don't eat. Humans, of course, also needed to develop an important knowledge of the toxicity of plants, because many wild plants, as I mentioned, are poisonous. What's interesting is that a lot of cultures didn't just not eat poisonous plants, but learned to develop ways to detoxify them and make them edible. There are a lot of examples of this, but perhaps one of the greatest examples comes from cycads. Cycads are wild plants, and the seeds were important parts of diets in various parts of the world, including in the Pacific Islands, in the south of the United States, in Florida, in Mexico, in Australia, India, etc., many places. However, cycad seeds are extremely poisonous. They have toxin in them and in neurotoxins, and these could be very damaging, and they could be even fatal. Yet human cultures across the world develop ways to detoxify them, ways to leach out the nutrients and make them edible so that they could become an important part of the diet. So wild food plants can play important roles in health and nutrition. Wild food plants are important in the development of ecological knowledge of cultures. And of course, wild food gathering and processing can play really important roles in culture. There's rituals and ceremonies involved with gathering, before gathering, the actual gathering event, with processing the foods, with eating the foods, etc. Stories that go along about how to gather or what happened to people who gathered along the way, etc. And myths as well about the origin of wild food plants and how that relates to cultures. The first time I taught this class, I asked the students to bring myths of wild food plants that were associated with their cultures or cultures that they identified with. And I'm going to give you an example of a myth brought to me by one student who was of Cherokee heritage. This is a myth about the origin of strawberries in Cherokee culture. So I'm going to read what she brought to me. This is a myth about the first argument between man and woman and their reconciliation. After living happily together for some time, the man and woman had a quarrel. The woman got fed up and left. She told her husband that she was going to find another place to live. She said to him, "You are lazy and pay no attention to me," and she fled to the mountains. But soon her husband missed her and regretted saying the harsh words that he did. He tried to catch up with his wife, but she was far ahead. He wanted to apologize, so he appealed to the Great Spirit to help. The Great Spirit intervened by placing various berries along the woman's path: huckleberries, blackberries, blueberries. The woman wasn't tempted to stop until he placed a field of strawberries in her path. She stopped and tasted the fruit of heaven, and she forgot her anger. She filled up her basket with strawberries, turned around, and took them back to her husband. The man, who was hurrying along his way to meet his wife, was surprised to see her returning and smiling. She smeared his face with strawberries from her basket, and he smiled foolishly and thanked the Great Spirit. Taking his hand, his wife led him back down the path to their homes, feeding him fresh strawberries on the way. And she says here, to this day, when Cherokee people eat strawberries, they're reminded to always be kind to each other, to remember that friendship and respect are sweet as the taste as ripe red berries. So again, just one example of myths associated with the origins of wild food plants and their relations to culture. Cultural practices can also involve manipulation of the environment to favor the growth of wild foods. When we think of gathering, often we just imagine people going out into the forest or the plains and just picking berries or gathering leaves. But often this wasn't the case. People didn't just go and gather what was there, but rather they learnt through their traditional ecological knowledge how to manipulate their environment in order to produce more of the wild food plants that they wanted. There's a really important distinction here because people aren't just going and gathering things from the environment, rather they're learning how to alter their environment to make it produce the kinds of things they want in greater quantities. One of the most important tools that people had or learned to do this was fire. And fire was used in cultures across the world, including west coast of the United States and Canada, Australia, and many other places. Many plants respond to the conditions after a fire, the open areas, the light, the nutrients, the lack of other plants, etc., and they grow very well. So indigenous peoples in various parts of the world used how to use fire to burn certain areas of forest so that the kinds of food plants that they wanted would come up in great quantity and they could harvest their roots or they can harvest their berries, etc. And interestingly enough, when those cultures changed, when fire was prohibited, and burning became less, those food plants have largely disappeared. The cultural significance of wild plants can vary widely from region to region. And if you have traveled, will have noticed that some wild plants in one place may be eaten, in other places they may not just be there as ornamentals. Hawaii, of course, is a great example of this, in that so many of the plants that we think of as ornamentals are actually consumed in other parts of the world. Just to give you some examples, torch ginger, that's a good ornamental that we have here in Hawaii, is eaten in other parts of the world like Indonesia. The cactus, panini, or opuntia, which is an ornamental here grown in gardens. It's also escaped and naturalized in some places, including Diamond Head and Makapu'u. A very important food plant. The pads are eaten in Mexico and southern United States, and the fruits as well. Coral trees. Some species of the coral tree the flowers are eaten in other parts of the world. Here we just think of them as ornamentals. Wild plants can be associated with cultural identity and social status as well. So some wild plants can be associated with very high culture, very upper classes. These could be things that are very rare. Sometimes you see it with like certain types of bushmeat can be have very high social status, especially when it's rare or hard to get. Certain types of mushrooms today can be only, are sold in very expensive markets or given in very, very expensive restaurants. Or the opposite, some types of wild plants are associated with poverty, low social status, etc. In some places where the poorest people don't have access to agricultural land, the kinds of foods that they eat can be associated then with lower status or poverty among those who do have agricultural land. Of course, the cultural significance of wild plants can change greatly over time. So something that was considered or had low status in one time can then suddenly be elevated and have really high status in another time. One very good example of this comes from Mexico. In Mexico, the staple of the diet is corn, and corn is grown together with beans and squash. But in the cornfields, wild plants also come up, different species of weeds, some of which I already talked about. So different species of solanum, of amaranth, chenopodium, etc. Collectively, these wild plants that come up in the cornfields are known as quelites, and they're harvested by the agriculturalists and they're eaten. They're really important sources of nutrition. As farming families moved into the cities, they began to stop eating these quelites because they were associated sort of with a peasant background. and so they lost their social status. However, then there was a movement among some people to try elevate them, the social status again, because they're such important sources of nutrition. People made recipe books about them, they served them in restaurants, etc., and now kilitis have regained their social status. So the key concepts to take home then are that all societies once depended on wild food plants, and today almost all cultures continue to use them in some capacity. Wild food plants consist of a wide array of plant species and plant parts. Consumption of wild food plants requires the development of ecological knowledge of the local environment, and this knowledge is integrated into cultural beliefs and practices. Gathering and processing wild food often represents important cultural activities. Wild food plants can play an important role in nutrition and health. And finally, the cultural significance of wild food plants varies over time and across cultures.